Thanks everyone for joining us for the last panel of the day and my personal favourite panel, Inclusive Political Systems. I'm Kerryn Baker, I'm a fellow with the Department of Pacific Affairs and I have very gleefully used this opportunity to chair a panel to bring a selection of amazing people who have been doing incredible work in research and in practice around the idea of building more inclusive political systems, very broadly defined. So I'll just introduce our panel very briefly, and then one by one they'll do their presentations, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. So first up, we have Irene Calmy, who has acted as legal counsel for the government of Solomon Islands and will be talking about legislative reform to promote equal participation of men and women in provincial assemblies in Solomon Islands. Moving out from the provincial to the national, we'll then have two presentations on constitutional reform processes in practice and perhaps more in theory in parts of the Pacific. So we'll have Kiali Molu, who is a PhD candidate jointly at the University of the South Pacific and the University of Bergen, who will talk about the 2022 Tuvalu constitutional process. And then Romitesh Kant, who is a PhD candidate here at the ANU, to talk about gender-inclusive reforms and democratic evolution in Fiji. And then finally, moving from the national to the regional level, we have Caitlin Mollica, who is a lecturer and program convener at the University of Newcastle, who'll be talking about Pacific youth engagement in regional forums. So I will hand it over to our first speaker, Irene. Take it away. That's for you. Oh, you don't need that.
Thank you. I am privileged and honored to be part of this very prestigious State of the Pacific Conference. This is my first time to be here, second time in Canberra. I mentioned to my daughter last night, oh, hurry up and let's go home. It's so cold here in in Canberra. Yeah, my grandson who is with me was just so loving it that even on the tile he was crawling around. And I was so worried, but I will not bore you with my presentation, and I hope you will enjoy it. Okay, I wish to talk about the recent developments in the Solomon Islands, the recent reform on seeking equal participation of women and men in provincial assemblies through legislative reform. The essence of this presentation is based on the question, how are inclusive political systems created? In April this year, Solomon Islands went to the polls. It had a national general election, the provincial elections, and the Honiara City Council elections, all three elections at one go. So a total of 20 women contested at the national elections out of 334 candidates, making up less than 6% of the field. For the provincial seats, women candidates did not do well. Women made up fewer than 5% of the provincial candidates and won just 3 out of the 123 provincial seats contested. A sole woman member was elected to 3 provincial assemblies. And for the other 6 provincial assemblies, all males made up the assemblies. 3 women were elected at the national level. 6 women candidates ran as independents, of which I was one of them, accounting for 30% of female candidates, compared to 34% of total candidates. 13 parties contested in the elections. Of these, 6 endorsed no women at all. Just 4 parties met the 10% threshold. So women and men's equal participation and representation in political leadership and government agency positions of leadership, decision-making, and governance is still one of the most challenging and least progressed gender equality objectives of the Solomon Islands National Gender Equality and Women's Development Policy. The evidence all points to the barriers stopping women from going up high in the leadership ranks. And this is also reflected in the results of the recent national general elections. Since independence, some 44 years ago, the number of women in the Solomon Islands National Parliament and provincial assemblies continue to remain very low. Like many other Pacific countries, women seeking leadership roles face many barriers, including a patriarchal culture, religious norms, lack of education, and money politics. As I said, I was a contestant myself in these recent elections, and I can say that these barriers are real for women. Most of us female candidates, contestants, encountered low funding availability to meet logistics and transport expenses. Also, for example, prior to the election, it was announced that 2 serving female members of parliament would not stand for re-election, stepping aside so that their husbands could contest their seats. Now, efforts to advance the equal participation of women and men in politics has always been a key focus of the Solomon Islands governments. The low number of women in politics is a problem because it hinders diversity, representation, and the ability to address the diverse needs of society. Increasing women's participation in politics is not only a matter of equality, but also leads to more effective and inclusive decision-making processes that benefit everyone. Hence, the call for the application of temporary special measures to address women's continuous low representation in politics. Sorry, I went down my slide. Prior to the 2024 election this year, the Solomon Islands Cabinet endorsed a proposal to amend electoral legislation to allow for temporary special measures or reserved seats for women in provincial assemblies. Women's organizations in Solomon Islands have been working tirelessly for years to progress this issue. I was one of those women, being the former Women in Leadership Technical Assistant with the Ministry of Women, Youth, and Children Affairs. I played a pivotal role in the journey and witnessed and heard firsthand the challenges women in the communities encountered whilst on community consultations. Now with the new government, the status of this amendment is still unclear, but the low number of women elected to provincial seats in the 2024 joint elections highlights the urgent need for such measures. The actual TSM, or temporary special measure, that is proposed to increase the number of women in provincial assemblies is the guaranteeing of additional elected seats specifically for women in provincial assemblies through legislation. And this guarantee is contained in a legislation called the Provincial Government Act 1997. So, in order for temporary special measure seats to be implemented, it requires amendments to the provisions within this Act. Now, currently this Act only allows for one person per ward. Hence, the current provisions do not cater for the implementation of additional seats for women. The temporary special measure seats can mean clustering of wards or the creation of additional wards. And in order for the Boundaries Commission to include it in its review, the creation of cluster of wards, provisions of the Provincial Government Act requires an inclusion of the definition of wards so that it can include the cluster of wards. And the current schedule of the Act, Schedule 3, it does not provide for provincial governments to make ordinances for temporary special measures. Therefore, this schedule can only be amended when the minister, with the consent of cabinet, to include in other matters under legislative space, so that provinces can have legislative competence to make ordinances on such matters. A particular provision of the Act only allows for provincial assemblies to make laws on matters within their legislative competence. So with the amendment of the Act to include TSM, this will give powers to the provincial assemblies to make ordinances for temporary special measures. So we can say that through this process, inclusive political systems are created. Now, the journey to caucus and to cabinet was tiresome, which involved huge sacrifice, many sleepless nights, support lobbying, and so forth. Caucus members wish to see the team's reports of all 9 provinces of Solomon Islands, support for TSM for their assemblies, and to show to them it was not only the leaders of the provinces that wanted TSM. Hence, the community consultation in 95% of communities in each province. The team braved cyclones, the cold, rough seas, malaria, lack of sanitation and safe drinking water, and island-to-island hopping to get to the communities. Come caucus second sitting day on 30th of December last year. The TSM paper was passed after the team brought in large volumes of reports of all the 9 provinces. So I believe seeing the stacks of reports gave no ground to the caucus members to refuse the paper. Pressed for time and the dissolution of Parliament last year looming, that same day it had no choice. And in the afternoon of 30th December 2023, Cabinet members resolved to endorse and pass temporary special measures for women in the Solomon Islands. As I sat in the Cabinet room that day at the office of the Prime Minister, I envisaged, or I wish Parliament is filled with women, men and women sharing decision-making and engaged in powerful political debates. That was one reason that led me to contest in the national general election. What is now next for TSM? Lobbying is now underway for the bill to receive the blessing of the Parliament, but with no immediate budget allocation for TSM, I can only pray it goes through the Parliament's floor this year. However, I am proud Solomon Islands is heading in the right direction in ensuring women have a seat at the tables of decision-making through the endorsement of temporary special measure or reserved seats. A long way yet to go before the playing field is level. So, for TSM to become a reality for other countries, it is important, in my view, that the frontliners must possess the vision, passion, dedication, commitment, and sacrifice the women in the Solomon Islands government, ministries, and NGOs have. Thank you. That is my paper.
Thank you so much, Irene. Okay. Robotesh.
That's not mine.
You're up.
Oh, let me test. Oh, all right. Bola everyone, good afternoon. So I'll be looking at post-2022 elections and the political transition that Fiji is currently undergoing, and the missed opportunities for inclusive political reforms. So in 2013, when the then military regime promulgated our fourth iteration of our constitution, which was gender blind, Ratu Choni Mandraiwiwi actually stated that we should cautiously be optimistic. A lot of us were very despondent, given the fact that it was a military drafted constitution that enshrined so much power in two elected officials. But he continuously said this constitution does allow for, opens the door a little bit for reforms at a later stage. When prodded when the later stage will happen, he said it will happen when it happens. Just be optimistic. Be cautious but optimistic. The space will open. And the space did open in December 2022, when after 16 years, the Bainimarama government lost power and a new coalition government came in. So there was a lot of optimism around reforms, 432 decrees that were passed between 2006 and 2014 needed to be undone. Women's organizations were very optimistic that some sense of gender inclusion might be part of this political reform as we embark on this journey to undo 16 years of authoritarianism in our political system. So as I mentioned, the constitution that was thrust upon us was very gender blind. The regime at that time did not believe that there needs to be any form of temporary special measures because these were seen to be discriminatory. Why give special recognition to a special group of people or a group of people? The idea that formal, there's non-discriminatory provisions, formal equality will translate into substantive forms of equality. So as the political space opened, the transition started, what we saw during the elections is the number of women contesting elections sort of stabilized, but more men were contesting the elections. And the number of women who actually won seats in parliament substantially declined. So there was hopes in 2014, we had a higher number of about 20 women who actually 20% of seats were occupied by women. So initially it was 16, but then it increased to about 20% women. So there was hopes that, okay, the system is a bit more inclusive, it's allowing for a bit more gender inclusion at the national parliament. However, it's slowly declined. And post-elections, in terms of board memberships, what we saw is that Fiji only has about 20% women represented on statutory and government-controlled boards. And what we saw post-elections was obviously there was a cleanup, try to replace the former government's people and put in your own people. And the old boys networks manifested itself. Men who actually felt left out in the last 16 years were rewarded with seats on boards because if they were unsuccessful in getting in parliament. So women were constantly being left behind. So I was in Fiji during this time for my PhD, which is looking at masculinities in politics. So a lot of women I talked to felt hard done by this. The promise, that the government will act differently and would actually reward women who deserve to be in positions. So the two missed opportunities that came to the fore, first was on local government elections. So the last time we had local government elections in Fiji was in 2005. When the regime came in, it just dissolved all elected local governments and appointed special administrators. So there was a massive centralization of the state that took place. And during this time, The number of people residing in urban centers increased drastically. So it's about 60% now. 20% of Fiji's total population actually lives in informal housing, informal settlements, and almost all these informal settlements are at the outskirts of these towns and cities. So there was massive problems that needed to be solved. Fiji has 13 municipal councils, 2 city councils, and 11 town councils. So what has happened is that the government basically said, it was allergic to anything democratic. So apart from the town councils, provincial councils, which were semi-autonomous, looking at indigenous Fijians, the semi-autonomous statuses were pulled back. The Rotuma Island Council was suspended. The Banaban Island Council was suspended. Elections to these, they were all appointed government administrators, basically looking after, different aspects of at the local government level. So this presentation is based on a small in-brief that Dr. Kerryn and I wrote about as the government was conducting its consultations on the Local Government Act, 1972. So in Fiji, our Local Government Act has not changed since independence. So there was massive reforms that required. So we felt like, the region, there are some countries in the region that are doing some amazing work around institutional design at local government level. So obviously Vanuatu came to mind, Bougainville came to mind. And we made a case that maybe Fiji should either look at these models or create more innovative models where people with disabilities get included into local government as well. However, this was not to be. The government rushed through the process. Very cosmetic changes were applied to the Local Government Act. So they just amended the act to allow for local government elections to take place with the idea that, temporary special measures, all these other things, will look at it after the elections get held. And we know in the Pacific it doesn't happen. Once it gets reformed, it's reformed for a very long time until there's political will to then change it. The problems with this act also is that our local governments do not have much power. So basically drainage, street lights, roads. Only Suva City Council actually has its own ability to control its own road system. The rest of the town councils and city councils actually rely on the government agencies. Rubbish collection. So the powers remain the same. They did not want to change the powers or devolve powers. Our local government elections were also unique because given the nature of the issues, a lot of ratepayers associations would contest elections when elections were held prior to 2005. So these were very specific interest groups that would form around local government elections, not necessarily political parties. The first time we had political parties contesting local government elections was in 2005 itself. So what has happened is that the government basically aligned the Local Government with the Political Parties Act. So political parties now can only contest local government elections. And in Fiji, to form a political party is a very immense task. You need 5,000 signatures, you need ELE audited reports. If not, you will be deregistered. There's political financing laws. So it aligned it to the national sort of legislations without allowing for unique sort of interest group formation within the local government. Devolution of powers, the powers remain the same since 1972. So it's basically management of parks, drainage in the town and city councils, collecting rubbish. Climate change is going to, all of Fiji's towns, major towns and cities are either by the sea or on the river, so it's close to the water. And climate change does pose a huge risk to people. 90% of Fiji's population actually lives by the sea or in, and there was no mention of sort of, is there a way to devolve powers to allow local governments to actually address climate change at the local level, given that 20% of the population actually lives in informal settlements. So that was one missed opportunity. From what I was told, the government was presented with a cabinet paper asking for temporary special measures to be implemented at the local government level. But then Attorney General's office wrote a memo saying that it's discriminatory. It's against Fiji's constitution, although Fiji is party to CEDAW and other international human rights. So that was a missed opportunity, but also missed opportunity in the sense that the promised elections is supposed to happen now, and there's no sight of it happening at all. The elections office says that they're not ready at all. The second one was political party financing. So we do not have constituency development funds, but what happened since 2014 was that the parliament would be given a pot of money to give to MPs just to go back to their constituents, hold meetings, do constituency sort of mobilizing work. So 15,000 from 2014 to 2022, $15,000 was given to each MP to do its work, and they did not have to report back on how they spent this money. It's just money every year. And it favored larger parties. So obviously how Fiji First operated was, let's amass as much power and money we can to do the work and handicap opposition parties. So the government introduced the new model, this new coalition government. So they introduced a $325,000 Fijian grant every year to political parties, represented in parliament. So these are only parties who are represented. So the 4 parties represented in parliament. It kept the 15,000 allocation, but then gave 10,000 tax-free to MPs to do its MP work, constituency work, and 5,000 to the political party for its political party running. The major rationale for this was during 2022 elections, a lot of these parties actually amassed quite a lot of debt, and this was going to pay back a lot of this debt. So Fiji First had about $1.9 million debt. The minor party, Sodelpa, had about $2 million debt. So they had amassed quite a lot of debt as well. So it was however, during the same time, the Fiji government adopted the gender-based planning and responsive budgeting. It was a big fanfare. They talked about how they're going to do gender-based budgeting. But when it came to political party financing, there was no gender qualifications attached to political party financing. One way in which Fiji could actually have, if local government elections was going to be political party centric, you could have actually dangled some money saying, have these many women in positions of power and you will get this money. If you don't, then we'll hold that money back. So it could have forced political parties to be more responsive to, or more inclusive. However, it just did not happen at all. So they continue to give that 325,000. So the women I talked to during my fieldwork talked about how they feel hard done by the regime, by the new coalition government. Sorry, it's habit. 16 years of, I think, regime. They feel let down by the new government, the promise of a better, sort of more inclusive democracy. It all seems to be, just rhetoric, and actions really did not match their words. We were in Fiji last year, and all the party leaders were saying, we want more women to contest elections. We want women to be in political parties, assume leadership. I attended 3 political party AGMs. All the women who actually held powerful positions in the party were replaced by men. So rhetoric does not really match, the actions, and there's a lot to be done, and I'm done. Thank you. Sorry, they make sure that I stick to time.
Sorry. Thank you. All right.
You still had 2 minutes. I just want to make that point.
Who are you? Kelly.
It's okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That's my fault.
Okay. Is it?
Yeah, all good to go.
Okay, Whaftailasi, all indigenous protocols observed. My name is Kiali, and I'm one of those struggling PhD students trying to survive the journey. And that's my project title, where I'm looking at the Tuvalu statehood and sovereignty in the face of sea level rise. So I was given this topic or the question to talk about in my presentation within 10 minutes. And as you can see, the project was from 2016 to 2023. I'll try my best to be an obedient. So, So briefly, I thought to answer the question, I'll talk about Tuvalu's context, previous constitution review, and of course the recent review, which is they call the project, constitution review project of 2016 to 2023, and also see the process review, whether it was inclusive and some problems. I think it's worth noting that my response to this question was based on and influenced through the interview I did with Tuvaluans when I went to do my fieldwork earlier in the year. So a lot of you already know where Tuvalu is, and for those who don't know, we are located halfway between Australia and Hawaii, and we are an independent state. We gained our independence from 1978 from the Gilbert and Ellice Island colony. And factors contributing to us wanting to be separated from the colony was influenced by culture and tradition, religion, and of course our cry for our own sovereignty. Under the colony, the British wanted us to stay together as one entity, which Tuvaluans strongly disagree. At the time, we were outnumbered by our Kiribati brothers and sisters by 1 to 10, putting us in a vulnerable state of being second-class citizen if we were to join under one entity. And also, notably, the cultures are a bit different in tradition, as Gilbert or Kiribati now are categorized under the Micronesians, while we are Polynesians. And of course, the Tuvalu way of life since independence has changed significantly due to an evolving climate and rising sea impacts. Not only our well-being, but our statehood and sovereignty, which is why it is very important for us to explore ways to fit our current status. And amending the Constitution is an important avenue for us to make those changes. So since independence in 1978, we have had 4 proposed review for the amendment of the Constitution. While there were amendments in 1986 and 2010 and the recent one, in 2008 was only the proposal for Tuvalu to remove the Queen as the head of state, which was defeated. So I don't know why we call ourselves independent sovereign state, when our head of state is still the Queen, now the King. So the 2016-2023 Constitution Review Project was an aspiration that was aimed to address pressing issues of the country. The central concerns addressed by the Constitutional Review was the existential threat posed by climate change to Tuvalu. The amendments explicitly acknowledge the country's vulnerability to the impact of climate change and its commitment to mitigating and adapting to these changes. These include provisions for measures to ensure the continued habitability of the Tuvalu Islands and the preservation of the nation's sovereignty. As a result, Tuvalu maritime coordinates were incorporated into the Constitution to ensure the country remain when or if its territory submerges. The amendment also emphasized strengthening the stability of Tuvalu governance structures to the executive parliamentary relations with the aim of promoting more effective and accountable decision-making processes. These changes were designed to address the sensitivity surrounding political and religious diversity within Tuvalu predominantly Christian population, ensuring that the country's diverse interests are represented and protected. As a result of this strengthening traditional governance, the Aligi, or the island chiefs, and the Falekaupule, Island House of Elders, were re-emphasized as decision makers and guardians of tradition and cultural heritage in Tuvalu communities, safeguarding Tuvaluan way of life from external influences. The constitutional amendment also introduced reforms to the judicial system with the goal of enhancing its independence and effectiveness. These reforms were intended to ensure that the judiciary is better equipped to address the complex legal challenges arising from Tuvalu's unique socio-economic environment and political context, including the country's commitment under international law. So this reform was also recommended in order for the judiciary to be independent, and also the Attorney General, who is the advisor to the cabinet, and was doing work at the same time as the Director of Public Prosecution. And as a result of this amendment, the DDP engagement was removed from the Attorney General, and the DBP position was separated, avoiding any conflict of interest. The final area of focus for the constitutional review was the protection of rights and the preservation of Tuvalu cultural identity. The revised constitution reaffirms the country's commitment to upholding fundamental human rights and recognizing the value of Tuvalu indigenous customs and traditions. This approach reflects the ongoing tension within Tuvalu regarding the balance between Western concept of individual rights and the traditional communal values that are central to the nation. On the 5th of September 2023, the Parliament of Tuvalu passed the Constitution of Tuvalu Act 2003, which incorporated the change recommended by the Constitutional Review Parliamentary Select Committee. So in trying to understand if the process of the project was inclusive, I refer back to my PhD journey and use the research approaches of transdisciplinarity and to look at the project if it was inclusive. So also with the interview with committee members, and also lead or chair of the committees from 2016 to 2019 and from 2022 to 2003, I concluded that it was inclusive. They were telling me that the island community were consulted, communities in the capital, civil service in the private sector, academia, reports or papers, and also science reports were also involved or used to make informed decisions in these recommendations. So this was the government telling me when I was having the conversation with them, until I talked to people on the ground. Almost everyone says that it was not inclusive, that what was the government telling them during the consultation process seems like they already decided what they want to amend in the constitution. So the people literally have very little say in the process of the constitution review. And also I talked to some of the groups, some minor religion groups, disabled person, youth, some youth group, who said they were never involved or asked to be involved in the consultation of the process of the consultation for the amendment to the consultation. So if you ask me again if the process was inclusive, I will side with the people. And I leave you with the question and young women posed to me when I was interviewing her. Thank you.
All right. So thank you, Kerryn and Sonia and the Department of Pacific Affairs for inviting me to speak at the State of the Pacific. I feel very privileged to sit on this panel with three wonderful speakers and three wonderful other presentations. I'm going to pull us back a little bit to think about regional forums in this context of thinking about what does it mean to think about and look at youth inclusion. So the value of creating inclusive policy with youth as co-decision makers has largely been ignored both in scholarship and practice. A notable exception to this is actually the Pacific, which offers important lessons and insights around the nature and impact of inclusive governance. Youth's importance to the development of inclusive regional policy that has broad objectives of peace, stability, and prosperity in the Pacific can be best understood by looking at the work achieved through regional governance architecture, such as Pacific Youth Forums. Often understood as leaders for the future, recent examples of regional engagement with youth highlight the importance of their collective voices in the creation of responsive global action frameworks. The significance of this attention to co-design with youth is particularly significant too, and for collective attempts to address complex transnational problems, including the pursuit of sustainable tourism. Drawing on a narrative policy analysis, what we do in this paper is examine recent attempts by the Pacific Youth Forum to engage with youth as autonomous decision makers and leaders in the development of inclusive policy for more sustainable tourism. And in doing so, what we show is that these actually are these really interesting spaces for inclusive interactions where there is knowledge sharing and knowledge generation happening at the regional level. And that's really significant because it's a space to challenge power hierarchies that are often built on age within Pacific communities through a collective dialogue. And if we think about the broader context of this for kind of what we can learn from it, it contributes to better understandings of the potential for governance architecture to achieve their objectives if they go from the bottom up rather than that traditional top-down manifestation. And in doing so, this helps us to challenge and potentially reframe what we mean when we talk about governance that is truly global. So the establishment of the Pacific Youth Forum for Sustainable Tourism was part of the broader mandate of the South Pacific Tourism Organisation Sustainable Tourism Policy Framework. Goal 2, Priority 4 of this framework identifies and centres the relationship between social inclusion and sustainable tourism and outlines explicitly the active role that youth play in achieving this outcome. Within this framework, youth are identified as key industry partners whose engagement through increased opportunities is essential to the overarching success of sustainable inclusive tourism in the region. By classifying youth this way as industry partners integral to co-design, the framework lends legitimacy to their insights and acknowledges their capacity to own the outcome of tourism governance. And you can see this kind of playing out here when you think about one of the key documents that was produced through these Pacific Island forums. And what's really interesting to look at when you think about this is how they situate tourism and sustainable tourism within broader contexts of economics, peace, disaster risk reduction. So the inclusion of youth as co-designers in this policy development framework really creates opportunities for more holistic governance and policy development. It's also just a really cool imagery of what it means to do policy and do governance. So the Pacific Youth Forum represents the first step towards the substantive participation of youth in tourism policy and destination development. As the online forum that they also did allowed for the opportunity and created space for youth knowledge across the sharing of information around issues critical to the region. Central to this inclusive webinar was a commitment to inclusion that is evidenced through the stated aims of the Pacific Youth Forum, which was to empower youth to engage in high-level planning and discussion, And this idea, this discourse that youth can actually participate at a high level is very unique when we're thinking about global governance architecture. You often, when you think about where youth are situated within global governance discourses, they are at side events. But what this did was seek to centre them within the broader discourse and dialogue. There was also a very conscious objective to provide youth recommendations for policy development, and again, that high-level decision-making, so centering voices of youth in the actual implementation and creation of policy development. These aims are significant in the context of claims for inclusive governance, as it values and places real impetus on their capacity to generate and create knowledge, which is a very unique thing to think about in the context of youth, where we often see them as vulnerable or we frame them as spoilers to these types of policies and practices. So using the language of empowerment is further evidence of a commitment to what we call subjecthood. So we really do seek to separate in this paper out this idea of agency, which can often be given, from ownership. And what we're talking about in this context is a step beyond agency, which is autonomous decision-making through ownership, which we associate with subjecthood in this context. And there is discursive implications here that think about youth's inherent capacity to participate and engage at a high level. And this is in stark contrast to, and it offers an important lesson for more internationalised architecture, where this high-level governance is often homogenised. And part of what we do in the paper is draw out how the Regional Youth Forum really centred youth voices, youth names, youth decision-making in the context of what was happening around the same time, which was a high-level UN Global Assembly event where the one token young person sat at the UN General Assembly with a sign that just said, young person. So there is a real contrast and a real disconnect happening where we can actually learn a lot from it as an international community in the governance perspective from what the Pacific is doing to engage youth as active decision makers. Youth leadership capacity and contributions to knowledge are similarly acknowledged in the second aim, which emphasises the development and dissemination of policy that is actually created by youth rather than created for youth. And the regional architecture through this Pacific Forum really goes to great lengths to ensure that the policy is led and created by youth. So the inaugural Pacific Youth Forum offers, as I've suggested, important insights for understanding the conditions and outcomes that emerge when governance is underpinned by this principle of co-creation with youth from the very outset. As one of the first regional co-creation forums of its kind, the Pacific Youth Forum on Sustainable Tourism used online platforms as well as in-person engagement to bring together 100 youth representatives from the tourism sector for what was known as a forward-looking dialogue. The emphasis on projecting forward is also really interesting in this context because it highlights a commitment to future-orientated strategies that, when associated with youth voices, indicates a responsiveness to inclusion, as it recognises the capacity for today's youth to invest as leaders now for the future, not as leaders in the future. And that's an important distinction. So there is an inherent balancing within the future-orientated classification between an acknowledgement of youth citizenship and subjecthood now and the narrow and marginalising classification of youth as what they are traditionally referred to as, which is becomings, so future leaders rather than leaders now. The relationship between these discourses is evident in statements of those in positions of power within the tourism sector. such as the CEO Crocker. And you see it up there. He talks about this discourse of sharing their insights and their ideas, of providing this platform where they have a capacity for meaningful contribution. And what I wanted to do was actually show you what the recommendations, what the actual outcomes were. So the recommendations developed by youth at the Pacific Youth Forum illustrate a clear prioritising of substantive participation and ownership in the formal governance architecture. Specifically, what you'll see is an highlighting of notions of involvement and of recognition, which remains central to the framework for action. There is also a key prioritising of the interconnectedness of regional and national policy, which is a core thematic target acknowledged and created by the youth. And this is directly becoming increasingly important as youth look to go back into their communities to engage as leaders in those communities for the implementation of these recommendations. So by highlighting the relationship between governance structures at multiple levels, the discourse created by youth highlights the importance of a coordinated system for ensuring substantive inclusion that has broad applicability beyond the tourism space. At the centre of understanding how youth perceive inclusiveness in this context is a focus on conditions that ensure youth's voices are embedded at decision-making levels, but that they are supported in providing those voices. They are resourced in the work that they are doing. This is reinforced by the invoking of the partnership rhetoric and a prioritising of a form of inclusion that is associated with increased opportunities for youth. And finally, there's the addition of this notion of substantiveness, that it's not just about rhetoric, it's also about what is actually done with that rhetoric. It's fine to ask us for a forum and to participate in a forum, but you also need to show us that there's going to be outcomes from that forum. And part of that is thinking about the next steps of this inclusive governance process, which is the access to financing opportunities, right? So really marrying up that idea of rhetorical inclusion with outcome inclusion as co-creation, as a model. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Caitlin. And can I ask all of our panel members to come and sit at the front? All right. So that was a range of perspectives on inclusive participation in political systems broadly defined. I appreciated the really diverse range of contexts that we're drawing from, as well as the mix of good news stories from Irene and from Caitlin, although I guess we have to wait and see in the case of Solomon Islands about the implementation, and what we might call cautionary tales from Romitesh and Kiali. So I'll open the floor up for any questions, comments, and reflections. Mosme. Sorry, Sonia. As far away as possible.
I need to get some steps up to go, so this is good.
Thank you. This time I put up my hand early so that I don't get missed out at the end. Okay, thank you everyone for your presentation. So my comment is for Romitesh. So at the moment, the things in Fiji are very fluid. Of course, they started with a lot of positivity and started that process of reviewing the Local Government Elections Act. But even while the review process was underway and they were taking submissions from people, it was brought time and time again that shouldn't we be reviewing the main electoral act first? And what if they make some amendments in the Local Municipal Council Elections Act, and it actually undermines the the future amendments that might come to the Electoral Act. So as you're aware, the Constitution is supposed to become amended, and they're still deciding whether the Constitution will be amended or they will go on from the process where the high draft left off. But they want to do a fast thing, so they won't probably go back to where the high draft left off. The indications are this, from what we are hearing from the government ministers, is that the government will try and table an amendment of the Constitution in Parliament. And of course, the main Electoral Act is due to be amended as well. If they don't do it next year, they'll be trying to do it in a rush just before the next election in 2026. And I think those are some of the reasons that probably the town council elections have not been held yet. So I think they're supposed to be held next year, and I'm wondering whether they will be held under the 2023 amended Town Council Act, or will there be amendments to that act itself once the main Electoral Act is amended? Yeah, thank you.
I agree. I think the main point is, yeah, reforms can happen, but it's the gender-sensitive reforms that is required. And that's the point I guess I was making, is that you can reform, but keep in mind, that, yeah, go ahead. James is...
No, you keep going.
I think the point is the reform with a gender lens is needed. And I think women's organizations for the last 3 decades have been asking for gender-sensitive reforms. So it happens on paper, just like the National Gender Responsive Budgeting. And it's done purely to appease aid donors, because aid donors want to see some document. But in terms of implementation, it just fails in that step. And I think that's the point I was making. But I can agree with whatever you've said.
Thank you. My name's James Batley, work at the Department of Pacific Affairs here. Thank you to all of the speakers. Actually, I've got a question for Caitlin. I'm asking as a former youth. But I'm wondering if you did any work on, how do the individual youths find themselves on these forums? Are they like the sons and daughters of elite people themselves, so that in fact they're kind of reflecting a mirror image of what their mothers and fathers might think? Or that could be, and it's interesting seeing the recommendations they came up with. It was kind of very focused on themselves, like, there needs to be a lot of investment in our group as a sort of interest group. So just interested in that aspect. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. It's one of the first questions that I ask when I do anything is, which youth? What I find so interesting and why I wanted to write a paper on this forum is that they weren't that. They were actually, it was a process to kind of participate in this Pacific Youth Forum. You had to apply, and the application went out to rural communities, urban communities, and I went and I did that work to look at who the young people were that participated, because that's the core tension, right? What started me on this, looking at this regional level and trying to find examples of kind of a good news story at the regional level, was my frustration with the UN General Assembly panel of the young person. And that young person was a young person that we've seen at every forum. They kind of bring her out every time they want a young person's voice on climate, on peace, on justice. It's the same young person. So I went looking for examples where it wasn't that, and was pleasantly surprised to find it here in this sustainable tourism model. I will say the caveat to that is the youth-specific forums that are about peace, that are about justice, are the same youth all the time. They are the urban youth. They are the ones that sit on the youth councils in their local communities. But this one, the tourism one, was very different. And I thought that was a really interesting model that we can think about around co-creation.
Thanks very much, Dr. Kerryn Baker, for organising this interesting session. I have a question for Irene Cowmey. Irene, you mentioned in passing something about a 10% mark or 10% benchmark or something like that. I wasn't sure what that was, so I thought that sounded interesting to find out more about. And I also have a question for Kiali Molu. Kiali, thanks for sharing with us about the new constitution. It was fascinating to hear about the maritime coordinates that have now been included in the new constitution and so on. You mentioned something about judges, something to do with the new constitution and something about a legal change to do with judges, I think, which I also must admit I think I missed it or didn't understand, but I thought it would be interesting to hear more about that, Kiali. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. The 10% quota I was referring to referred to the quota that is in the Political Parties Act, where parties must have women representation in their political parties. It hasn't been realized in reality because most women do not know about political parties. They're not informed about the need to join political parties in order to meet that quota. So that was the quota I was referring to.
Yes, thank you for the question. I think you were referring to the Director of Public Prosecution's role that was played by the Attorney General of Tuvalu. And we know that the Attorney General is an advisor to the Cabinet. So the DPP position and role was played under the Attorney General for a long time. And this new amendment ensures that there's a separation from the Attorney General. So it has already been separated and it's independent.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, presenters. I am Bal Kama. I will make some contextual comments to Kiala's, because I was involved in the drafting work. I was one of the only external people that work with the team, and we traveled to the islands and did the consultation. I think firstly, thank you for providing that ground level perspective on what the people think. It did fit in. I think it does fit into what we perceive was the correct process. So it sort of helps to understand that. Let me just say that Tuvalu constitutional amendment was one of the most significant legal reform in the region in the last 10 years. Why do I say that? It not only responds to a domestic issue, but it challenges international law. And I was involved in drafting some of those provisions. And just to help your research and anyone sort of looking into this work, the section 2 that says perpetuity of statehood. There is no constitution in this world that declares perpetuity of statehood. One would ask, why do you need to declare perpetuity of statehood? Why have coordinates in the constitution? It challenges international law because international law does not recognize a state disappearance due to climate change. Drafted in 1932, the Montevideo Convention has a very limited definition of what statehood is. Tuvalu, if displaced, does not meet any of those elements. So Tuvalu, by declaring perpetuity and therefore influencing other states to pick that up, it will contribute to customary international law, state practice and customary international law, which will now create an exception to the Montevideo Convention. It's a very significant, groundbreaking legal reform. And Pacific Island Forum picks that up 2 months later in the PIF declaration that says, yes, we do recognize the Pacific states to be in perpetuity. That was directly influenced by Tuvalu reform. And many other smaller states across the world now being influenced by that. And the more states picked it up, it becomes state practice. And eventually, state practice leads to customary international law. And that will create an exception to the more conservative definition of statehood under the Montevideo Convention. So just to add that on, the other thing that to add to the challenges with the consultation, Tuvalu did another consultation in last year, and I found it very fascinating because they had some amendments where, especially human rights, as you pointed out, there were some disagreements. So the members have to travel back to the main islands. And I was in one of those boats. It takes about 28 hours on the boat. But for them to come back to the people and saying, we have disagreements, serious disagreements on these things, tell us, chiefs, tell us people, how can we navigate this? And then to get direct response from the people, I found it very genuine, very ingenious way of going back to the people when there's disagreement at the reform level. May I finish by sort of giving another comment on, back to the previous conversation, previous question to you, what the judge's role is. Another aspect of that reform, which is very groundbreaking for Pacific Constitution, is that in all Pacific Constitution, the need to consider Pacific values and custom is discretionary on the judge. The judge is not compelled. Whereas Tuvalu, learning from all this Pacific experience, took a more decolonial approach by saying those values are quite important that we are now obligating judges to consider. So by providing a mandatory obligation on judges in the Constitution, Tuvalu is a step ahead of many other Pacific constitutions in terms of struggling with getting, especially Western-trained judges, to try to wrestle with customs. And at most times, they disregard it. Tuvalu is making that pathway for other Pacific states, hopefully, to actually follow. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sir, for sharing those reflections. And I totally agree with you. And here I was at the beginning of the presentation thinking, I hope no lawyers was involved in the process in Tuvalu too. And thank you very much for sharing that. Yeah, I totally agree with you. And this is a small component within my overall project. I'm looking at analyzing the Constitution to inform my project. So thank you very much for sharing that, those comments. Thanks.
Thank you so much for the presentations, panelists. I have a question for Kiali. My name is Aka, and I come from Kiribati, and I just want to congratulate the government of Tuvalu, because I think this is setting the trend for the rest of the small islands to follow. And Dr. Kama, you just provided the nuance into this very important exercise. So my question is on the Falepili Treaty. Because in the new constitution, there is mention of the continued recognition of Tuvalu's statehood in the face of climate change. How does that work with now 280 people being able to migrate to Australia under the Falepili, but also under the Pacific Engagement Visa? And how do you see this statehood facilitated through that pathways, or those pathways? Thank you.
Thank you, Aga. That's a good question, and a question that I think a lot of people have been asking me, which I don't have a proper response to it, except from a diplomatic point of view. I don't have any, I cannot speak for people, but I can speak for my own. I think there's a misconception too in the creation of the treaty. A lot of people thought that this is an Australian-driven initiative, when in fact it's a Tuvaluan-driven initiative. And we think that because Australia finally recognized the importance of being in the Pacific and working with Pacific together on pressing issues. It's a difficult question to answer. In terms of a statehood and a sovereignty, of course, there's going to be brain drain, there's going to be muscle drain, and a lot of people look at it in different ways. When I talk to a lot of people in Tuvalu, what I found out is that a lot of them wanted to use the opportunity as an economic pathway and also viable way for them to provide for their families. A lot of them say they want to come to Australia to work, but they want to go back home and live their life there. There's good and there's bad in there, but I hope the government of Tuvalu and Australia will continue to work together and challenge on the challenges that might arise in the treaty. But this is a good conversation question.
Hello. Oh no, just forgotten. Nope. I'm trying to think. Make a coherent question. Sorry. Pretty much everywhere in the world, there's a perception that young people are more progressive than old people. Although there is some debate about whether there is actually a change as you get older or whether it's a demographic thing. But in all of your experiences, but I thought, Caitlin, you might know a bit about this with the Pacific Youth Forum. Are young people more progressive towards ideas like gender quotas, or are they more progressive towards ideas like protecting the climate towards the future like we would expect in most Western countries?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's really interesting because intergenerational scholarship will actually show you or tell you, and it's kind of empirically been shown to be true, that progressiveness actually goes with the generation and is usually triggered by an event, right? So the Vietnam War generation is more progressive, for example, than other generations before and after it. In terms of kind of young people, it really does depend. Depends on context. It depends on culture. I thought the speaker this morning, when she was talking about Bougainville and kind of the collective communityness, the leading with care, the leading with love and with kindness, was very prolific, because I think rather than thinking about young people as kind of a progressive group, it's important to think about young people as kind of a diverse group. They don't all believe the same things, but there is a general trend towards leading with community, leading with love, leading with kindness, hearing and taking seriously the diverse views of their peers is also really important. Sometimes that leads to progressiveness, sometimes it doesn't. And I think that's really important to acknowledge, because I think one of the key mistakes that we make in the international governance architecture is to do the thing where it's all young people, right? So yeah, it's a really good question though, and it's something that I think a lot about, because it's the assumption, right? Rather than actually looking at what is being said. Okay. My question's actually to Irene, and it actually follows on very similarly to this, because I want to know kind of what the role of young people in the Solomon Islands you think is in moving forward gender equality, particularly through kind of governance structures in the Solomons.
Thank you, Caitlin, for the question. Yes. Young people-wise, in terms of decision-making and participation in leadership space, they are progressing. They are progressing because there are youth forums established now, and it's not only based on topics that surrounds or centered on youths, but in the recent election, a youth managed to get into parliament. And for the youths, that was a big win, because he had no political knowledge, and he didn't base his campaign on finance. It was basically a purely community show that got him through. So I would say Solomon Islands is progressing in terms of the recognition of the politics space, and I was part of the amendment or the change of the National Youth Congress policy and act that was recently changed, and I see a lot of youths stepping up and putting up hands to come forward and be leaders. So I can say that it's progressing. Thank you.
Thank you. This is not a question, but I just wanted to make some reflections based on Bougainville. Firstly, to say Bougainville being a Melanesian region, inclusion is sort of inbuilt in the social structure, meaning men make decisions, women are regarded as being administrators of the details of the decision, but in most cases, it's the implementation that sort of excludes, that sort of sidelines certain people. So for us in Bougainville, it was like we had the conflict for self-determination, but eventually it turned out to be a civil war, Bougainville versus Bougainville. While men were involved in the war itself, women now took up the leadership. So for women, it was a leadership that they developed themselves, that they exposed themselves to become, leaders, to be recognized as being leaders. So I think reflecting on Bougainville, inclusion is all about ownership and responsibility. You need to own the challenge or whatever the task is, and then have that responsibility. And for me, I obviously had a very good experience of this when we were preparing Bougainville for the referendum. Jointly, we agreed with Papua New Guinea that our preparations will be participatory and all-inclusive process. In that process, what we did was everyone were given a task, a responsibility, a time frame. This is what you do, and you report back at this time. So that is obviously how we prepared Bougainville, based on giving them the ownership and making them responsible to do the task. And I think for Melanesia, my understanding is if we will just sit back and expect inclusion to work, that will not come. We can have the best legislations, best policies, best programs, but if that ownership, that leadership is not taken on and implemented inclusively, inclusivity will not come. That's just a reflection. Thank you.
Question down the front, and then I'll hand over to the panel for last reflections.
Hello everyone, my name is Kate Keys-Tilley and I'm studying, sorry I'm really nervous, oh my gosh, International Studies at RMIT Uni, and I'm looking at my question and I'm sure this may have been answered in Caitlin's presentation already, but I'll ask anyways. So we are seeing a big growth in the Pacific Youth Forum, but also if we're looking externally, we also have the ASEAN Australian Youth Strategic Partnership as well. I've been lucky enough to witness a few of these, and it's been amazing meeting all these young professionals, which, yes, it's been amazing. So my question is I really would like to ask, how would these forums manifest into proper policy change and more recognition for youth in policy making specifically? And also from your research as well, are we actually seeing recognition within governments, specifically in the Pacific, but also in Australia as well? Thank you.
In terms of youth inclusion, we are at a point, I would say, an inflection point where the rubber is about to hit the road, because you are seeing young people saying, we keep getting invited to these forums, but it never actually gets implemented into an outcome, right? So I think actually we need to, it's a really great question, and we really need to think about and change the conversation at this point, where it's not about let's invite the young people to the forum, let's set up a youth council, but the conversation is, what is the responsibility of governments, both national, regional, but also international architectures, to actually take seriously and produce outcomes that respond to the forums and dialogues that young people have already done. Right? I think we are at this inflection point where you're going to start seeing young people say, I don't want to go to another youth dialogue. I don't want to go to another youth forum, because every time I do, we produce a communique or we produce a report, but the government never actually implements what we've told them that we need, right? So it's now, we need to show that we have heard. The responsibility is now on the government to fulfill their obligation to young people as citizens, right? I think what is often missing from a conversation about youth inclusion is that young people are citizens, right? There is an obligation. Governments have an obligation to young people, just as they do to every other citizen, but we often forget that, right? So I think it's an inflection point. We need to tip the conversation in the other direction. But it's a great question. Something I think a lot about.
Does anyone else from the panel have any final reflections? Yeah.
Oh, can I just say, as Caitlin was talking, I was thinking about Fiji and the youth. There's a lot of youth adjacents that you need to research, because I mean, no, I'm just saying, in Fiji, there's that whole idea around youth in transition. Yeah. And then once they've transitioned out of youth, 45-year-olds are still youth. Yeah. And they dominate all these spaces. I was just looking at the National Youth Day celebrations, and it was dominated by, and it's the constant sort of problematizing youth as a demography and a problem to be solved. So in Fiji, the drug crisis right now, it's a youth problem. It's a drug problem, but it's also a youth problem. And it needs to be solved because young people are more prone to taking drugs. When you see all these spaces around, it's very tokenistic youth participation, youth involvement, generally. And we have had youth parliaments, we've had National Youth Council, which is dominated by 35-year-old plus, and they call themselves youth adjacent, or I'm still a youth. Or we've been in a 16-year dictatorship, so you have to take out 16 out of my age because I've lost my youth. Yeah. So that's the sort of the reality. And what young people in Fiji, I'll speak for Fiji. What young people in Fiji have done is they've carved spaces for themselves, and these are creative spaces like climate change. And right now, the climate movement in Fiji is actually led by young people. The West Papuan movement is led by young people. So they've carved spaces where they feel they are being seen but also heard, and they actually have an impact on the decision. And in terms of government policy, just like women, I don't see anything changing at all. It's very tokenistic sort of representation of young people. Let's just bring them in the room. We've consulted, go back, we know what's better. And this is the stuff that we constantly see in politics as well. We've got a 29-year-old as an MP who constantly gets berated for not having experience, whatever that would mean. In Fiji, I think experience would mean, you've participated in coups, because that's the only qualifier for getting into politics. But that's the kind of stuff that we constantly get faced with. You don't have experience. And I think it's, to answer PJ's question, it's very hard to talk about, progressive or not, because it's complicated. You have culture, you have religion, but you also have ethnicity in Fiji. That complicates these issues. You have rural-urban divides. I grew up in Fiji, in Suva, in this urban, so I'd probably call myself more progressive than someone who's from the rural area. So it's very subjective kind of question where you cannot really, and it's the young people in Fiji, the 128,000 who did not vote in Fiji, it's mostly young people because they feel powerless, even though the voting age has been reduced significantly. So there is a huge problem addressing sort of, this. And Fiji's, I think Pacific has a youth bulge. Fiji's, I think it's 50% of Fiji's population is below the age of 35.
They have a high youth demographic.
Yeah.
We don't like to call it a bulge.
Oh, sorry. A high youth demographic. But yeah, that's so, and it's a problem because it's always seen youth as a problem. So it's a problem that needs solving, and they are not part of the solving bit. It's a solution done on them, not with them.
Those are important questions to end on. We're not going to solve the issue of lack of inclusion in political systems today, but I think the discussion and bringing all these different case studies and different experiments together has been really worthwhile nonetheless. So thanks to our audience, thanks to Sonia for helping out so amazingly, thanks to James and his team, and thanks to our brilliant panel.